Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudy.net, and we've been talking about the sort of Reformation that takes place in the 6th century, 5th century BC, after the two separate deportations of the Jews with their religious ideas and their religious documents into the area of Mesopotamia, particularly eastern Iran and eastern Iraq and western Iran. And so I want to sort of talk more about these reformers. We said that the time frame and the historical changes that we can see here is one reason to believe that the influence goes from Judaism into the reformers here that are then, as a result of the influence of Judaism, reforming their own existing Indo-Iranian or Hindu ideas. But there's another reason that we're going to see here with Jainism and Buddhism, and that's a comparison to the life of Moses. And so let's talk about who Moses was. According to Britannica, they're talking about what we find in the book of Exodus. According to Britannica, in the book of Exodus, Moses was born in Egypt to Hebrew parents. He is found by Pharaoh's daughter and is reared in the Egyptian court. And with the help of his brother Aaron, Moses pleads with Pharaoh for the Israelites' release. So that's just a summary of what you find in the texts of the Old Testament. Essentially what we find is that Moses is reared as a member of the royal household of Egypt, although he's an adopted son of that household. And he sees the oppression of the Israelites at that time, the lower class. And as a result of that, he desires to help the lower class. He ends up having to flee for his life because he tries to take that upon himself. And he ends up also living a much more simple life than out in the desert tending flocks for a number of years before he's sent back to help out the oppressed and lead the Israelites out of Egypt and away from slavery. And so you have this figure who's a royal figure who is concerned with the plight of those who are suffering, and then that's where this religious idea comes from Moses, becomes the figurehead for a major religious change in the Old Testament, at least recording down the events that had traced their way back to Abraham. And so do we find this pattern in some of the reformers? Well, in fact, when it comes to two of the major reformers of Hinduism at this period of time, Jainism and Buddhism, we do find that as well, that additional corroborating detail that they are being influenced by the inflow of Judaism to their area, with enough time for that influence of Judaism to spread to where Hinduism now has the reformations of Jainism and Buddhism. Plenty of time for that to spread into the area. So what is Jainism? Well, according to Columbia Encyclopedia, Jainism tradition teaches that a succession of 24 saints originated the religion. The last, Vardhamana, called Mahavira, is said to seem to be historical, according to normal historical standards for determining historicity. Then Britannica says that Jainism, although traditionally dated to 599 to 527 BC, Mahavira, the founder of the religion, must be regarded as a close contemporary of Buddha. So what do we find in comparison to Moses? Well, we find, according to Britannica, that Mahavira, like the Buddha, was the son of a chieftain of the warrior class. At age 30, he renounced his princely status to take up the ascetic life. He spent the next 12 and a half years following a path of solitary and intense asceticism, and then he begins to gather for himself 11 disciples who were originally Brahmins, showing that he is indeed a reformer of the Brahmin Hindu religion. And following the pattern of Moses, coming from royalty, going to live a simple life, and then his desire to, in some extent, help out potentially the lower classes, although that's not said here specifically. But certainly he seems to follow some of the patterns of Moses. What else can we say about Jainism? Well, let's talk about its historical evidence, the historical documentation for it. The Jain canonical scriptures, according to Britannica, do not belong to a single period, nor is any text free from later revisions or additions. It's transmitted orally and first systematized in a council at the end of the 4th century BC, so it's orally transmitted until the 4th century BC. Little can be said about that first council, and then there's two later councils, the early 3rd century AD, and then again in the mid-5th century AD, and that 5th century council is considered the source of the existing canon. So we have oral traditions that go down to the 4th century. Then it's systematized for the first time about 100 years or so after the second deportation of the Jews, maybe 300 years after the first deportation of the Jews. But then those canons that are developed at those councils, it's not very much can be said about it, and what we have today as their canon is a 5th century AD document. So it doesn't stack up in comparison to Old Testament Judaism so far, particularly concerning the time frame. If we had to choose between the two, going objectively saying what is the historical, how much historical evidence we have to verify these, Judaism is in a much better position. Next, if we move forward here, we can find out a little bit more about what the Jains have to say about their own sacred writings, their own historical documents. And they say, according to Britannica, the original unadulterated teachings of the saints are now lost. the two different sects of Jainism agree that a time will come when the teachings will be completely lost, but they disagree, however, about the extent to which that corruption and loss has already occurred. So they already know we're in a process of losing our understanding of Jainism and true Jainism, and that the historical texts that they have already undergone some degree of that loss, and they disagree as to how much has happened, but they both agree that at some point in time it will be completely lost. So if we're going to ask, what is the belief of Jainism, and how well can we figure out what those beliefs are and historically what they were? Even the Jains themselves say that their historic documents are questionable in this regard. So again, it doesn't quite stack up in terms of the date or the content of the written materials for Jainism. We'll move on from there to talk about Ajivika, which is another sect from this same time. What is it? So according to the Columbia Encyclopedia, Ajivika, the doctrines are related to those of Jainism, and its founder, Gosala, which is dated to 484 BC, was said to be a friend of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. According to Random House Dictionary, Ajivika is simply a heretical offshoot of Jainism. So whatever we can say about Jainism, we can largely say about Ajivika. And particularly because, as Britannica Encyclopedia states, the doctrines of Gosala and those of his followers are only known to us from Buddhist and Jain sources. So we don't actually have any separate, independent historical documentation for Ajivika. We have to look to Buddhist and Jain descriptions of it, and those descriptions are frequently not complementary, as is stated also in Britannica. And so it's very difficult to reconstruct what the Jains or what the Ajivika believe, and therefore very scant evidence to base any kind of historical analysis of the viability of their claims. And the last thing to know about Ajivika is that the sect it's extinct, really. This is not a contending world religion at this point. It's an extinct sect. And so the Columbia Encyclopedia says that the sect rapidly declined and survived actually until the 4th century AD, and now it basically is no more. And so then we're going to move on from there to Buddhism, because there's not much we can really say about Ajivika on a historical level. And what about Buddha? Where does it come from? What is the time frame? It's the same time frame that we would expect. According to Britannica, the Buddha was born in the 6th or perhaps the 5th century BC, plenty of time for the Jewish influence to have spread from 721 and 586 BC into this area. And according to the Columbia Encyclopedia, he probably lived from 563 to 483 BC. What do we know about him? Well, according to the Columbia Encyclopedia, Siddhartha Gautama, which is the proper name for the Buddha is a title. Siddhartha Gautama was born a prince and raised in luxury, but he renounced the world at age 29, which sounds very similar to Jainism. He searched for an ultimate solution to the problem of suffering innate in the human condition. Very much like Moses, he's raised his royalty, he renounced his royalty, he lives a more simple life, and he's concerned with the suffering that people have every day. So very good reason to believe that he had received some input of the Jewish religion at that point, which had been around and had time to move into that area for several hundred years. What do we know about his life? What can we say historically about the Buddha in terms of the historical evidence? Well, the story of his life is overlaid with legend, and the earliest written accounts date 200 years after his death, according to the Columbia Encyclopedia. And the Columbia Encyclopedia goes on to say that his teachings were orally transmitted until the 1st century BC, when they were first committed to writing, and the earliest extant versions of the scriptures that we have date from the 1st century AD. So if he lives in the 6th century and his writings are transmitted orally until the 4th century, that's a good 400 years difference or more between when he lived, his events of his life, and when they first began to record it. How does this stack up to the New Testament? Well, it doesn't stack up to the New Testament in particular very well at all, because the New Testament documents show that the life of Jesus Christ was recorded within decades, and that we have thousands of copies of it from around the same time, within a couple hundred years, rather than having the 400 years of oral tradition about Jesus before anyone writes it down. So again, when we compare religious documents and the historical evidence for them, we find that these religions of these reformers of Hinduism are not stacking up very well against what we find in the Judeo-Christian tradition so far. So we'll stop there and we'll come back and continue in just a moment.